Well, that's what we are having. And of course, Uganda is regionally affected by multiple natural hazards, including droughts, earthquake, floods, landslides, and volcanoes. Flooding, particularly in low-lying areas, present the largest risk, if I should put it that way. And each year, flood alone impacts nearly 50,000 people and over $62 million in gross domestic product. Now, joining us tonight to have this conversation to understand more about the disaster is the chairperson of the Committee on Climate Change, Honorable Songa Biyika Lawrence. And of course, Seith Mugume will be joining us via Skype, an environment expert. You're welcome, Honorable.
Thank you very much.
Nice to have you, Mr. Seith Mugume, if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Let me start with Honorable Songa.
Yes.
First things first, what do you make of the current disasters we're having? We're having too much flooding, we're having locusts, we're having buildings falling, the climate change. What do you make of this?
2 weeks ago in Parliament, I said sometimes problems come in twos. Sometimes in threes. And one thing was we had the COVID-19, we had the locusts, we are also now having floods. So these problems will continue, especially on the climate change perspective. Climate change was there, is there with us, and it will continue. What we need is only adaptation. And therefore, Uganda had been facing the changing weather pattern, which has resulted into climate change over the years.
Okay.
And it has affected everyone. And the most affected are women and children. Unfortunately, majority of the women and children, especially the women who are affected by climate change, are also smallholder farmers. So this has impacted on the economy of the country because we have 68% of our population engaged in subsistence agriculture. So these people are hit hard by the changing climate. Yes.
Okay. Mr. Seith Mugume there, anyone watching these stories would imagine at this time more than any other time, what would you say to afford these disasters? Why do we have these recurring, according to your expertise, especially when it gets to floods?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Andrew Chamagero. Good evening, viewers. As Andrew has introduced me, I'm Dr. Seith Mugume. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, Makerere, and I'm a water resources engineering expert, and my specialty is in respect to flooding. One thing that we can see from the current events that are happening in the country is that we are having the impacts of climate change. We are now experiencing them in our day-to-day lives. Climate change has led to an increase in the average rainfall that we receive, but also it has led to an increase in the intensity of the rainfall. So we get a lot of rainfall within a very short period of time. And this leads to a phenomenon that is called flash flooding. And the flash flooding is now much more intense in the mountainous riverine communities, rivers that are flowing from very high mountains and then coming through to downstream communities, such as what has happened in Kasese. Of course, climate change is not the only factor that is leading to flooding. We are also having degradation of catchments upstream, mainly due to deforestation, and also the issue of intensive cultivation and very extensive land use practices in Uganda. And then, of course, we have the issue of urbanization. Many people are migrating from rural to urban areas, and when they reach the urban areas, the cheapest land that is available is usually in the low-lying areas, which are usually flood-prone.
Okay.
So that's why we are now having the impacts of flooding and the flood-related damages becoming a big challenge in Uganda at the moment, particularly in the mountainous areas, but also in urban areas like Kampala.
Okay, right there. Honorable,
Yes.
the impact of the disaster can be reduced through investment in preparedness activities. If I should go the floodplain policy development, of course, we have the effective watershed, land use planning, and flood forecasting. Do you see a time when these investments will be in place in Uganda?
Yeah, thank you very much. Climate change can easily collapse the economy if it is not handled properly or if it is not addressed. What we are calling for is to have resilient infrastructure.
Okay.
Resilient infrastructure in terms of having resilient roads, bridges, and housing. Because when these flash floods come, they will destroy this transport system. And you know, there are factors that the economy rely on. Energy, industrialization, transport. Now, if transport is affected, it will definitely cut off economic activity in the country. So we need those policies, yes. We need those policies in place, and the policies must be enforced. And if you take, for example, the effect of climate change, which was experienced, drought was experienced between 2010 and 2011. It made the GDP growth rate move from 5% to 3.5% just because of 6 months drought in the entire greater Horn of Africa. So if we don't address climate change, it will affect and collapse the economy. And once the infrastructure is affected, moreover, most of these infrastructures, we have developed them based on high interest loans.
Okay.
And they collapse just within 2 hours or 3 hours of rain. That is a big loss to the country. So we must give priority in terms of policy, legislation, and also financing for climate change.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Seith, before I let you go, in the case of Kasese and Lake Victoria, how deeply are our communities informed about these disasters, and how ready are our communities informed?
Okay, thank you, Andrew. In regard to, for example, what is happening currently with Lake Victoria, the lake has increased by close to 2 meters over a very short period of time of 7 months, and this has led to flooding of the communities that are living along the lake, also the island communities. And also because an immediate strategy, it has been to increase the flow in the River Nile from approximately 1,200 cubic meters per second to now 2,400 cubic meters per second. So that has led also to flooding of the downstream communities along the Nile and then along Lake Choga. So what we need is to do comprehensive flood risk assessments and mapping, and then based on that, these communities, the flood-prone communities, can be zoned, and then using the flood risk maps that are prepared, it can be communicated to the communities that these are flood-prone areas, and development should not take place in these flood-prone areas.
Thank you, Mr.
Normally,
Mugume.
when you're dealing with flooding with very high return periods, because the last time we had these lake levels, high lake levels in Lake Victoria, it was in 1964, and then it recurred around 1979. So the people lose their memory when the event does not reoccur over a long period of time. So as a country, we need to ensure that these areas are mapped properly, and then they communicated to the communities.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mugume. Because of time,
then of course they can be demarcated
Mr.
and
Mugume.
gazetted as flood-prone areas that should not be approved for development by the relevant authorities.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mugume. Honorable, as you're winding up from your side as a policymaker, what is the best way to integrate disaster preparedness and management into a development process for a nation?
Very good. For a very long time, I had been advocating for disaster preparedness, not disaster response.
Okay.
Because in most cases, we rush to take relief aid to the disaster-affected areas. But what we need as a country is to prepare for those calamities. When they come, it should get that we have mitigation measures before we become. Our ministry is supposed to be Ministry for Disaster Preparedness.
Yes.
But in most cases, we are doing more of response to relief in form of relief aid. So we really need policies that can be geared toward disaster preparedness, and that will require some contingency fund or climate change funds, which can help to address those disasters. And for a very long time, we have been advocating for this kind of funds, and we are going soon to table the climate change bill, which will come to Parliament, and we shall ensure that, and we are calling for support that we should have that climate change fund so that it can help in this kind of preparedness. In other countries, they usually know that this is the trend of disaster, this is the sequence, and they usually prepare for them. But for us, when these disasters come, we rush with mabati sheet, we rush with cement. That is not what we need. What we need is to prepare and mitigate those measures. In Netherlands, they are building dikes because they are preparing for disaster.
Thank you so much. That is Honorable Songa Biyika Lawrence, the chairperson of the Climate Committee in Parliament. Now, take us